But good to have everyone this morning. We are coming down to the end of our series on the book of Matthew. I think by my count we have 2 classes left, including today. So I'm glad you've stuck with me on our journey. But today we're going to continue on the trials. And I think I meant to, I hope this is the right set of slides. I may have forgot to change part 2 to part 3. Let's hope for the best that we got our slides right. But if just as a little bit of a recap so far, the last 2 weeks we've been going through the trials of Jesus, and as a little bit of a recap on that, obviously he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the first place he's taken to is Annas, who's the former high priest, the father-in-law of the current high priest, and he's taken there for questioning. We know after that he was taken over to Caiaphas for this kind of middle-of-the-night tribunal that he had to endure in front of the Sanhedrin at Caiaphas' home or in the courtyard, where he was subjected to incredible amounts of injustice for all the kind of illegal activities that the council took to get him to the point where they had a conviction for blasphemy. Then they wait a little while and have another daybreak tribunal in front of the Sanhedrin for a second conviction of blasphemy. Then he's taken over to Pilate, and Pilate's like, well, what are the charges? And they're like, not blasphemy, but sedition, tax evasion, claiming to be a king. And he endures a first set of questioning in front of Pilate. And then Pilate, what does Pilate say? I don't see anything wrong. He hasn't done anything wrong. No charges. But come to find out, he discovers that Jesus is a Galilean. So he sees an opportunity to avoid responsibility of handling the matter. So he sends him over to Herod. Herod was excited to see Jesus because he wanted to see a magic trick, essentially, is what kind of the scriptures read. And Herod doesn't do anything with it, so he sends him back to Pilate, and that's kind of where we're going to pick up again today. Now, one thing I didn't touch on in this first set of this first hearing in front of Pilate that I did want to just touch on very, very briefly. In John chapter 18, verse 36, it says, in this questioning in front of Pilate, Pilate is questioning Jesus about all these claims. And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. And Pilate's response to that is, you are a king, then. And Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And this is where we get that famous response from Pilate when he says, what is truth? And you could spend a whole probably series kind of dissecting that question. Probably the most important question any of us could ever ask, what is truth? Interestingly enough for Pilate, he's asking Jesus what is truth, and what does John 14 verse 6 say about truth? Jesus says, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. So he's literally speaking to truth as he's asking this question. But the conclusion of that was there was no basis. And then again he goes to Herod. Herod seems unimpressed. After Jesus doesn't respond to him, Herod seemingly just wants to kind of get rid of Jesus, and so he puts a white robe on him, sends him away. Obviously, the symbolism of this white robe is they're mocking Jesus for claiming to be a king. And we don't really know this hearing in front of Herod. We don't really know if this was, considered any form of formal inquiry. But again, another part of this trial process that should have alleviated Jesus of any wrongdoing in the eyes of their laws. So now we're going to come back to Pilate. So we're going to start in Luke chapter 23. Our slides? Yes, got the right set. Okay. Luke chapter 23, we're going to start in verse 13. Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him. So we've mentioned a little bit before, obviously when we went through the trials in front of the Sanhedrin, they were just error after error after error procedurally from their rules and procedures. But then when he comes to Pilate, Pilate seemingly, at least in the first part of his interaction with Jesus, seemingly is following protocol, so to say. He's treating this trial or this manner with Jesus before him as a new set of circumstances. He's not necessarily leaning on the evidence or the witnesses that the Sanhedrin had brought forward. And he comes to the conclusion in his first go-around that Jesus had done nothing wrong and there were no charges deserved. But we're about to see Pilate make a very significant procedural mistake. So in verse 15, he announces that Jesus has done nothing to deserve death, but he says, "Therefore I will punish him and release him." Now, the therefore right there is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting. And you've probably heard a lot of speakers and teachers say, what's the therefore? Personal, I don't like that phrase very much. I get it, but that's just a kind of a personal thing for me. But the therefore is there for a very specific reason. The term therefore literally means for that reason. So it's a word that is intended to bridge the gap between analysis and application. So in my world, when I'm reading through like a court opinion or something, you'll read through pages and pages and pages of all this analysis, and it's just a bunch of legal jargon and mumbo jumbo, and then you see a therefore, and it's like, indicator, we're about to get to the meat and potatoes. We're about to see the purpose of all of this. So when you see a word like therefore, again, it's intended to bridge the gap between analysis and application. And so when we look at a verse like this, and he say, he has done nothing to deserve death. There's your analysis. Pilate has gone through his questions, he's gone through his inquiries, and his analysis is he has done nothing to deserve death. So what is the application that he then applies? I'm going to punish him. And I think there's really two ways that you can look at this phrase. One, I think you have Pilate's intent. And if I'm put myself in Pilate's brain right now, I'm probably thinking that these words come out sounding a little bit like this. He's done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will release him. But I'm probably going to punish him too, just to appease the mobs. It's kind of a throwaway line, at least from Pilate's perspective. The punishment portion. But the actual meaning, as we know, because we know how the story plays out, is he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him. And then the release him part's kind of a throwaway line. Because we know, does he ever get released? No, he doesn't. So this statement here has always really stood out to me because it doesn't really make a lot of sense on its face. He's done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, as a result of that, I'm going to punish him. Another word that's really heavy here is the word deserve. He has done nothing to deserve death. Some of your Bibles may say he is not worthy of death. The Greek word that's used here is the word axios. And the term literally means to weigh, like on a scale, and assign a matching value to achieve balance. So you think the first thing that obviously comes to mind when we talk about that is you have this scale, right? We're all familiar with scales. You think of the statue of Lady Justice holding the scales, and it's the idea on one end of the scales you have the crime, and on the other end of the scales you have the punishment. And we often use the phrase, does the crime fit the punishment, or does the punishment fit the crime? And so it's this idea, if you have a crime on one end of the scale, the punishment has to balance that out. And when you kind of apply that to this situation, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Because on one end of the scales, you have the crime. And Pilate's proclaimed he's done nothing to deserve death. So what goes on the scale on the side of crime? Nothing. But then what ends up happening on the side of the punishment? We've bottomed out because he ends up receiving punishment. He ends up going to the cross. He ends up dying for something he did not do. Well, scales require balance. So if on one end of the scales, on our punishment end of the scales, that we've now bottomed out, what happens to the side of the crime? We've now gone into the negative. And like I said, scales require balance. So what happens in practicality when and how does that apply to us today? Well, Jesus literally reaches onto our scales and takes those crimes that we've committed, those sins, takes them off of our scales, plops them on his scale in order to balance the scales. Jesus got what he didn't deserve so that I don't have to get what I deserve. And it's an interesting thought because, on practical terms, and if you go ask kind of the common person about this concept of scales, I think most people would say, well, don't we each have our own set of scales that we have to try and balance? Shouldn't we all be judged by our own merits? But I think another way to look at this is Jesus literally broke the scales so that we can go to heaven, and that we can spend eternal life with him. Again, scales require balance. And there's a lot of, you'll hear a lot of people ask the question of, why did Jesus have to die? Could there have been another way? Could there have been another method by which God had to do this? And this was really the only way. And the Bible talks pretty clearly about that. But because our scales had to be balanced, Jesus plucked the sins off of our scales and put them onto his. And by the way, this was in fact this big procedural mistake that I was talking about with Pilate. Jesus suffered punishment not because he had done anything wrong, but because Pilate was trying to appease the mobs. A verse I want to mention real quick. John chapter 10, verse 17 says, "The reason my Father loves me is I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me." We've mentioned this verse in this class already. "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again." Again, all of this seemingly, from an outsider's perspective, looks as though Jesus is not in control of the situation, but he is absolutely in control of this situation. We're going to flip back over to Matthew chapter 27, and it says, "Now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time they had a well-known prisoner whose name was Jesus Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, 'Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?' For he knew it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him." So Mark and Luke's account tell us a little bit more about Barabbas. Luke chapter 23, verse 19 tells us that Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. So on one hand, he was a revolutionary. I'm going to presume that he was proven guilty of that. Don't know if the court process was as unjust to him as it was to Jesus, but we can presume that he was proven guilty as a revolutionary. And also as a murderer, again, presumably proven guilty. Now, Matthew tells us that his name is also Jesus, which is interesting. Jesus Barabbas specifically, which is a little bit interesting because what does the name Barabbas mean? You'll read through Scripture where you'll have references to, like for instance, it'll say Simon Bar Jonah. Bar, the phrase bar means son of, so we say Simon, son of Jonah. And then what is Abbas, or Abba? Means father. So his name is literally Jesus, son of the Father. And Barabbas woke up that morning as a man destined for death, but found freedom in life through the death of another. Seeing a little imagery here, some symbolism. Now, all four accounts make reference to this custom of releasing a prisoner at the festival. Now, we'll say that there's no, at least I couldn't find any historical record of, outside of the biblical accounts, of this custom at the Passover. But it would not have been uncommon for prisoners to have been released at an event, just historically speaking. This seems, throughout multiple cultures, this was kind of something they would do at times when they would come to gather together. Seems like a little bit of a strange custom to me to be in celebration mode and just start releasing prisoners. I kind of would equate it to, you go to the rodeo, and in between the bull riding and the mutton busting, they just decide to release some prisoners of violent crimes. But that was their custom, and that's what they do. Now, I'm not sure if this custom was established by Pilate or if it was established by one of his predecessors. We're not really sure, or how long they had been doing this custom. But the gospel accounts do, in fact, and all four of them mention this custom. And it's believed that the purpose of this custom, again, this was during Passover, so it's believed that the purpose of this custom was to honor the night when Pharaoh's firstborn son died, so that God's firstborn, Israel, so to say, would be released. So there's some symbology or symmetry there. Also, this custom has a lot of similarities to the Jewish customs related to the Day of Atonement. I'm going to read from Leviticus chapter 16, starting in verse 7, says this. And this is talking about Aaron. Then he is to take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He is to cast the lots for the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. But the goat chosen by the lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord and used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. Again, a little bit of symmetry to what we see in the Old Testament. But yet, this is another way that Pilate is trying to avoid making a decision about Jesus. So remember, go back. He's already found him not to be guilty of anything. He tries to avoid making a decision about Jesus by having Herod deal with it. And then he's now trying to avoid making a decision by putting it to the people, putting it to a vote. Let the people decide what they want to do. And I don't know if in his mind he genuinely thought that they were going to choose to release Jesus or not. I don't really know. But I halfway suspect that that's probably what he was hoping for. Now, verse 18 says, "For he knew that it was out of self-interest that they had handed Jesus over to him." So he recognizes kind of the game that they're at. He recognizes that they're out for their own interests. Some versions will say they did it out of their own envy. But we know that Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, and he recognizes the hypocrisy and the true motives of the accusers. And he can recognize the lies through the charges that they brought to him. Now, it's also interesting that we talked about Barabbas. It's interesting that both Jesus and Barabbas are essentially being accused of the same crime. Sedition, insurrection, kind of all fits in the same bucket. And so it would be easy to look at this situation as if Jesus is being exchanged for Barabbas. However, I think another way to look at it is Jesus is literally taking the place of Barabbas. He's stepping into Barabbas' shoes and receiving the punishment that Barabbas should have taken. An innocent man taking the penalty so that there's no penalty paid for the guilty. Again, a little bit more symmetry there. We go on to verse 19, and it says, "While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: 'Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him.'" And we've talked a little bit in this class. I really love these just random details that we get in Scripture. You're reading through a narrative, and you're following the story, and then you get a little detail like this, and you're like, where did that come from? And I also wish that we had a lot more detail to this, because this fascinates me. But Matthew is the only account that mentions this, and that mentions Pilate's wife in general. But it talks about that she has a dream, and she's going to Pilate and saying, "Don't do anything to that innocent man, because I have suffered greatly, or a great deal today, because of this dream." Now, the Bible talks a lot about dreams. You can probably think of a few just off the top of your head. By my count, there are 21 mentioned dreams in the Bible. 6 of those are found in the New Testament. And, typically when you think of dreams in the Bible, they're usually attributed to some type of message being delivered by God. And usually that they have a direct purpose in trying to further God's will. You think of Jacob and Jacob's ladder. You think of Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dream. You think of Daniel interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In the New Testament, we talked a little bit about Joseph, Jesus' father, earthly father, and he wanted to, when he found out Mary was pregnant, he wanted to leave her quietly, but he was told in a dream to stay and raise the child and name him Emmanuel. We talked in this class about another dream Joseph had when Joseph and Mary and Jesus fled to Egypt to get away from Herod and the decree of killing all the babies under the age of 2. And he was, I guess, told in a dream, given information in a dream, that Herod was no longer alive and it was safe to return to Israel. We talked about the wise men having been sent a message in a dream not to return the same way that they had come to visit Jesus, because not to go the same path, to run into Herod again. So dreams play a very significant role in the Bible. Now, all that to say, I think usually, and for the majority of my life, when I would read through this verse, it seems as though you're trying to figure out, well, why would God send this dream to Pilate's wife? What would be the purpose of that? What would be the reason why he would want her to have this dream and to suffer for it? Now, we're going to get into little theory territory here, so I just want to give a forewarning that this is not, this is just some ideas to be thinking about. But when you think about this story, you think about all that's going on, you think about all the implications of what's happening right here. And now you have Pilate's wife come to Pilate and say, hey, don't do this, I'm having a dream, and I'm getting this bad feeling about it. Who has the most to lose with Jesus dying on the cross? Who has the most to lose? Think about that for a minute. Who has the most to lose with Jesus dying on the cross? Satan. 1,000%. Satan is the one person, one being who has the most to lose from Jesus dying on the cross. So one theory that's been thrown out there is that this dream potentially did not necessarily come from God, but rather it came from Satan. And just think on that for a minute. And this has been a theory that's been thrown around a lot over the years. Apparently Martin Luther was a big proponent of this theory. But the idea is that Satan was trying to prevent Jesus' death by influencing Pilate's wife and therefore stifling God's plan for salvation. Now, we talked, I think it was our third class in here, when we were doing Matthew chapter 4, when we were talking about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. And we talked a little bit about what Satan's motivations were for trying to get Jesus to sin. And so obviously it was on Satan's radar that if he can get Jesus to sin one time, he wins. The game is over. Jesus was being served up as the perfect sacrifice, right? And so if that sacrifice is no longer perfect, it's blemished, it has sin, it's no longer worthy of absolving us of our sin. So Satan had to have that on his mind. And now we're getting to the point in our story where this sinless lamb, still no sin, this sinless lamb is being led to the slaughter, and he's on the verge of being sacrificed. And that sinless lamb is now on the verge of being sacrificed. And so we've talked a little bit in here about the Bible makes pretty clear that the sins of those that came before had been forgiven. They were credited righteousness because of their faith. The Bible's very clear about that. But we do know that sin up until this point in time had not yet been punished. Romans chapter 3:25 says this: God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. So again, the sins of the world had not yet been punished. They'd been forgiven, but they had not been punished. And the wages of sin is what? Death. There has to be death in order for sin to be fully punished. So it's theorized anyway that it's possible that Satan is witnessing the sins of the world finally receiving its punishment, and now he's desperately seeking out options to stop that from happening. That is a really heavy thought. Now again, it's just a theory. I don't want the takeaway to be that's what the Bible says, because we're making a lot of assumptions here. But I do think it's an interesting idea to think about and ponder. Now, I will also add that the apocryphal account of the Gospel of Nicodemus, again, an apocryphal account is not going to be canon to Scripture, so take it with a grain of salt. But the Gospel of Nicodemus mentions this dream, and it mentions Pilate's reaction to it. And he's actually a lot more concerned about this dream than what Matthew's account indicates. And in the Gospel of Nicodemus, it mentions that Annas and Caiaphas persuade him that his wife's dream is a sign of Jesus' sorcery, and proves as a little bit of a motivator to finally pull the trigger, so to say, to get Jesus onto the cross. But again, that's from the apocryphal account of Nicodemus. Sure.
So is the point here that if Satan could get Jesus to sin by not going to the cross and obedience to the Father, he would win?
Yes. Now, I will also add, and we talked in this class, I think 2 classes ago, Satan obviously played a massive role in Judas's mindset. So that seems to be a little counter to this idea or this theory. Excuse me? Rocky's question? He was basically trying to summarize, I think, kind of what I said, and it's this idea that if, from Satan's point of view, if he can get Jesus to sin one time, then he wins. He wins the game. I guess one way to think about it is he's run out of time. He recognizes that clinching moment is about to take place, and so wait a minute. Maybe if I can prolong this process, it gives me more time to, do what I need to do. Yeah, again, it's just an interesting thought to carry with us. Okay, going on to verse 20, it says, "But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. 'Which of the 2 do you want me to release to you?' asked the governor. 'Barabbas,' they answered. 'What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?' Pilate asked. They all answered, 'Crucify him.' 'Why? What crime has he committed?' asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, 'Crucify him.'" In verse 24, "When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. 'I am innocent of this man's blood,' he said. 'It is your responsibility.' All the people answered, 'His blood is on us and our children.' Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified." So Pilate has clearly lost control of the situation. And I want to go back to these scriptures right here. Put yourself into the shoes of the people who are in this crowd. I don't know how big the mob was. I don't know how many people were there. I imagine it was quite a few people. But Barabbas is throwing out there, "Who do you want me to release?" And he's got these 2 men standing here. One of them Jesus, one of them Barabbas. And he's saying, "What do you want me to do?" And they're all shouting, "Barabbas. Release Barabbas." And then the counter question is, well, what do you want me to do with Jesus? He's done nothing wrong. What is their response? Crucify him. And you can probably imagine the scriptures itself is very, I guess, linear. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but I can imagine it was a chant. They were shouting, they were chanting, it was getting aggressive, they were getting more violent with the more times they begin to shout this. But Pilate has clearly lost the control of the situation. Now, do you think that he really released Barabbas? I know the scriptures say he does. But you think about just kind of how ridiculous that is on its face. Again, this was all a little bit of a stunt to try to get to the point where the crowd would decide to release Jesus. But they want to release the guy who's a violent murderer. And so on one hand, you have the violent murderer. On the other hand, you have someone that he's proclaiming has done nothing wrong. It just seems a little far-fetched that he would actually want to release Barabbas. But his intended outcome obviously has not played out, and he convinces himself that he is not responsible for the situation by washing his hands in front of the crowd. What a coward. That's really all I got to say to that. What a coward. We've talked a little bit in here, this idea of situations arising that convince us of certain outcomes and ideas. I think it's comical that Pilate thinks that he can just wash his hands of this and say, "Ugh, not on me, guys." He had full control, or the full opportunity to control the outcome of this, but he was too much of a coward to do anything about it. And this is actually the place in our vernacular where we get the phrase, I'm washing my hands of this. We say this from time to time. This idea of, it's now outside of my control, let it be, it is what it is. But again, it's a little bit on a false premise in this position with Pilate, because he actually does have control if he wanted to take that up. But also listen to the response of the crowd to what Pilate says. This is what they say. They say, his blood is on us and our children. Excuse me? Yeah, his blood is on us and on our children. What a response. So not only do we want to release Barabbas, not only do we want Jesus to suffer and to die, but they're willing to go a step further and say, his blood is on us and our children. People are so desperate to be passionate about a cause that they will start to say things that they don't even understand. And this is not applicable just to this period of time we're talking about. This happens today. Look in the world today. People are so desperate to be part of a cause that they start to say things that they don't understand. And you can go political with that if you want to. We're not going to get into that. But there's a lot of examples in our world today where that's the same mindset still applies. We're so often desperate to be part of something, to be part of the crowd, to be part of the majority, that we're willing to say things like that.
In Acts 19, when the Demetrius had decided to riot, he said all the people were there, but most of the people there did not even know why they were there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's referencing Acts 19 with another riot that began, and it says they didn't even know they were there or why they were there. But again, we have a situation here, and you go back to, I think it was in verse 20, you have the chief priests and the elders literally in the crowd persuading people to ask for Barabbas, which is kind of interesting. You put yourself in the shoes of one of the bystanders to this whole thing, okay? And, most of the crowd who's there, we don't know, but the initial trial that took place was behind closed doors. We know it was in Caiaphas' courtyard. Remember, Peter wanted to get in initially, and he couldn't. There was somebody at the gate preventing him from getting in, and he had to have a contact, a connection, help him in. So that whole trial took place kind of behind closed doors. This daytime trial, we don't know who all was there. We don't know who all was there when Pilate was saying these things about how he was innocent. But most of the people, I'm making an assumption here, but most of the people in the crowd who are witnessing this moment right here probably don't have much of a background as to what's been going on for the whole night. And, again, when they had gone to Pilate's house, all this stuff that happened outside of Pilate's home, because they didn't want to go inside lest they be defiled, right? But most of the people probably didn't really have the background exactly as to what's going on. But they're standing here, they're seeing Pilate up there. He has these two men up, and they're casting lots, essentially, to who they want to release. But they see their leaders going in amongst the crowd and telling people, hey, this is what you need to do. This is who you need to vote for, essentially, persuading them. And you can only imagine that they're witnessing this and seeing this, and they're like, well, obviously, we've put our trust in these guys. We've got to follow their lead. And they fall in line. So it's at this point in the story that Pilate has Jesus flogged. And this would have been a Roman scourge, and they would call this tool that they used, they called it a flagrum or a flagellum. Now, I do want to spend a few minutes talking about flogging in general and what the scriptures are talking about when it says flogging. Now, I do want to give you a warning. We're going to get into some details. But I think it's important for us to be mindful of exactly what would have been going on here. So the flagrum, as I mentioned, that's a Latin word, and it was essentially a short whip made of 3 or more leather strips connected to a handle. And these leather strips would be laced with pieces of bone shards, metal, or nails. And a common tool that would have been connected to the end of the flagrum would have been the knuckle bone of a sheep. I thought that was an interesting detail I ran across. So they would literally find the knuckle bone. So you think of a sheep, and it's knuckle bone, and they would lace it to the end of this thing, and they would beat people. Now, the ends of the flagrum were short, which gave soldiers more control over the cuts. So you think about, when I think of a whip, first thing that comes to mind, Indiana Jones. You got this long whip, he's got it looped on his belt, and it's a long distance weapon. This flagrum that they would use was really short. It was purposefully designed to be that way because it had more control. A longer whip, you lose a little bit of that control. And if you had these long ends, you would risk severing arteries in the neck or in other places and rendering a quick death. And again, the purpose of this was not to have a quick death. The purpose of this was to inflict pain. The purpose of this torture was to prolong the suffering. It wasn't designed to be efficient. It was designed to be painful. Now, sometimes, again, the process, oftentimes would be used for people as a form of punishment, but sometimes they wanted the victims, maybe they were sentenced to death and they wanted them to die. And so sometimes, if they wanted the individual to die, they would first dip the scourge into goat's blood in order to cause infection to create slow and painful death. The point was to beat the person and then leave them alive. Although some historians wrote that sometimes those who were sentenced with this punishment did in fact die, like we mentioned. But the victims that were left to live would live the rest of their life scarred and disfigured and would be essentially a walking billboard to everyone who could see them that this is what happens when you mess with Rome. Don't mess with Rome. These are the consequences. Now, the flagrum would sometimes contain a hook at the end of it, and if it had a hook on the end of it, it was often called a scorpion or a scorpio. And we actually have a reference to that in 1 Kings chapter 12. Verse 11, it says, "My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions." So there were different kinds of whips, essentially, that they would use, and they had different purposes. But scourging would quickly remove the flesh, leaving skin hanging like ribbons. It will expose the bloody mass of muscle and bone, sometimes even exposing internal organs. The flagrum was a powerful weapon of torture and a brutal punishment carried out by professionally trained soldiers, where the victim would be essentially stripped naked, tied or shackled to a sturdy column or in between two columns. You'd sometimes have a center column that you were tied to. Sometimes you'd have two columns with your arms outstretched. But usually the way that they would administer this is they would have two soldiers, each with their own flagrum in their hands, and they would alternate hits for a continuous, steady beating. Typically, the Roman soldiers were trained to begin with the upper torso. They would beat down the back, down the chest, up the back of the legs, above the knees, and then up the arms. And sometimes more than one whip was used on the legs and arms. So usually they would try to avoid using the flagrum on arms and legs because you would essentially rip off limbs if your arms and your legs were much more fragile with a flagrum. So they would use a different kind of whip for that. The weighted ends of the weapon would tenderize muscle and would strike with a concussive force that could bruise internal organs. Sometimes against the chest, especially when your arms are raised, this beating would cause contusions of the heart, sometimes predisposing the heart to rupture if the beating was followed by a crucifixion. So imagine you're receiving these concussive forces against your chest with a whip or on your back, and then your body is being subject to a hanging on the cross where your blood flow is hindered by the fact that your heart has been so bruised. Obviously, blood loss during a scourging was incredibly severe. Sometimes the victim would lose consciousness from extreme blood loss, and although soldiers aimed their cuts, archaeologists have found remains of scourge victims who had been hit in the face or even on the top of the skull, which would often render an immediate death. But when we see this, and again, this is the kind of stuff that Jesus was going through here. Again, all for the purpose of appeasing the mobs. You go back to our verse when we talked about earlier where Pilate says, "He's done nothing to deserve death, therefore I will punish him." He hasn't done anything wrong, but we're going to do this to him. But when we say things like, his blood was poured out for us, that's not hyperbole. His blood was literally spilt for us. And this is also the reason why Simon of Cyrene had to carry the cross for Jesus. It wasn't because it was his custom to have someone help out. It was literally his body was broken to the point where he couldn't. The English word fillet comes from the Latin word flagrum. So when we're talking about this tool that was being used to beat with, that's where we get our word fillet. So just that adds to the severity of what we're talking about. Now, there's a church historian by the name of Eusebius who recounts in vivid detail, not necessarily this particular instance, but scourging in general. And this is what he wrote about it. For they say that the bystanders were struck with amazement when they saw them lacerated with scourges even to the innermost veins and arteries, so that the hidden inward parts of the body, both their bowels and their members, were exposed to view. Now, how many lashes would Jesus have received in this scourging? And the answer to that is we don't really know. Under Jewish law, you could not be whipped more than 40 times. Deuteronomy chapter 25 in verse 2 says, "If the guilty person deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make them lie down and have them flogged in his presence with the number of lashes the crime deserves. But the judge must not impose more than 40 lashes. If the guilty party is flogged more than that, your fellow Israelite will be degraded in your eyes." So the Jews would always stop at 39 because, what if they miscounted? They didn't want to accidentally sin against God by going over that number. We know in 2 Corinthians, Paul mentions having been beaten with 40 lashes minus 1. But Jesus isn't being subject to Jewish law. He's being subject to Roman law. For the Romans, the punishment was not so much about the number of lashes you would receive, but it was about beating the person within a step of death and then backing off. And so I'll note again that this infliction of this flogging on its face was illegal, but even more so than that, would have been bar to any other further punishment. We have a concept in our world today, we call that double jeopardy. If you're sentenced to you receive a punishment for a crime, you can't then receive a different punishment for the same crime. And under this circumstance, Jesus was being beaten for a crime that he didn't commit, but he's also crucified for a crime he didn't commit. So that's a step further. But again, all of this is to appease the mobs, even after Pilate announces Jesus' innocence. Going on to verse 27, says, "Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand. Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. 'Hail, King of the Jews,' they said. They spit on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. They mocked him, they took off his robe and put on his own clothes on him, and they led him away to crucify him." Now, I think it's important to be reminded of this kind of stuff. Growing up, and I remember Davis, my son, got baptized a few years ago, and we're talking through, the process of the Lord's Supper and what that means and what we're supposed to be thinking about. And when those trays are passed in front of us and we have this cup and it's nice and neat and it's uniform and it's a clean cup and that's what we're drinking about. But this is the kind of stuff that we need to be mindful of. The suffering that he went through on our behalf. And I think it's important that we carry with us how brutal this suffering actually was. And also how corrupt of the process that he had to endure in order to get him there. And again, this isn't anything that Jesus was victimized by. No one lays down Jesus. Jesus lays down his own life, and the scriptures make that very clear. But next week, we're going to get into kind of the final stage of all this and into the crucifixion, and we're going to get into some more of that detail. But I appreciate you being here this morning, and we'll see you next week for our last class. Thank you for being here.